This morning we said a lot of thank yous to Lorraine and to Daniel, and I'd like to add my thanks to those as well for organizing this, and to Harvey. It's been very interesting to listen to the papers and the presentations this morning. It's a real pleasure to be back at McMaster. I'm one of the people who did use the archives here, and I was talking about that with Michael on the ride to campus. I made very good lifelong friend. I don't know if she's here yet. Dr. Catherine Gary is an archivist in the archives here through my interest in the archives of Ray and Emily. So a real pleasure to be back at McMaster and to be part of this event. My aim in this presentation is to contribute 2 main points to the project that brings to McMaster this weekend 17 outstanding international scholars of Canadian literature for an exploration of the Canadian government-sponsored program, Understanding Canada, which was in place for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. And in particular, the relationship of that program to Canadian literary studies abroad. My first point, Understanding Canada introduced constraints on the study of Canadian literature, which had long been a major focus of international as well as national Canadian studies. Second point, international scholars of Canadian literature managed to continue their work both under the program and even, in fact, in spite of it. So 2 points then, in tension with one another, in tension. T-E-N, S-O-I-N. On the one hand, a constraint on Canadian literary studies, a constraint that stems from the support priorities of the Understanding Canada program, and on the other hand, ongoing productivity by scholars of Canadian literature, in particular for our purposes here this afternoon, those who study Canadian literature abroad, which is our focus. To this end, I will proceed in 2 ways. Beginning with some information about Understanding Canada and about the ICCS, which is familiar to many people in the room, but for those coming from the education seminar, stands for the International Council for Canadian Studies, which administered the program Understanding Canada on behalf of its sponsor, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, or DFAIT. I will present data on Canadian literary studies under that program during those 4 years. Then I'll turn to 4 examples of international Canadian studies research contributions to Canadian literary studies during the period. As these examples will show, international scholars of Canadian literature have produced work worth celebrating, not least of all because they have done so despite the challenge to Canadian literary studies presented by the priority areas of the Understanding Canada program. So, the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade introduced Understanding Canada on April 1st, 2008. And for those of us in literary studies, we often said this was no April Fool's joke. The new program replaced DFAIT's then existing and long-standing Canadian Studies program. That's all it was called, the Canadian Studies program. And here is my dear colleague for whom I just signaled. Welcome, Kathy Gary. Long-standing program, and it established 5 priority areas or themes for international Canadian studies going forward. And here we can see them. They included peace and security in Afghanistan, North American partnerships, which is really about Canadian-American relations, managing diversity, and I'll say a special word about that later, environment, energy, and economic development and prosperity. The new program did allow for themes described as, quote, directly related to the mission's strategic priorities in the region, end quote. But of the 5 priority themes, this did not speak in any obvious way to the kind of research and publication on Canadian literature that had been such a significant part of Canadian studies, both at the national and international levels. It is helpful to note here, for those for whom this might not be ready knowledge, the difference between international and national Canadian studies, which work collaboratively but are funded separately. The International Council, the International Canadian Studies community, is formally represented by the ICCS, and it receives funding from Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. Just a quick word on the ICCS. It was founded in 1981, and it comprises 28 or 30, it goes up and down a bit, associate member associations from all around the world. So from Europe, there's a lot of European countries represented here, but it's active in Asia, Korea, Japan, it's all through South America, with some bit of a toehold in Africa. I don't know if that would work out now that the funding has been cut. So it's represented around the world, and it represents some 7,000, they say, scholars from over 70 countries. Now, among those countries is Canada. Canada figured among the ICCS member associations through its then National Association for Canadian Studies, literally just called the Association for Canadian Studies, the ACS. That is until 2007, when the ACS executive of the time withdrew the association from the ICCS. There's a long story behind that, and we might have a chance to talk about it. Well, a word about the ACS, and as you can see here, it was established in 1973, so it predates the international organization, and it is funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Until recently, I think that we could say it represented Canadian scholars in Canada, Canadian studies scholars, that is, in Canada. Since 2011, however, a new national organization, the Canadian Studies Network, or Le Réseau d'études canadiennes, the CSN, fulfills that role for many Canadian studies academics in Canada. Now that organization is supported merely by fees from its members and its institutional and individual members. It now holds associate membership in the ICCS. Today it's trying to establish full membership. That requires 100 members and a series of activities. Well, that's a little bit of background on those. It can be a humbling experience to attend the ICCS annual general meeting or its biennial conference to see just how many scholars around the world are devoted to the study of this country in its many different dimensions: cultural, political, geographic, economic, and so on. Among these areas of research and publication, Canadian literature and literary criticism has long held, or had long held, pride of place. A fact worthy of note and indeed a celebration, particularly, I think, in light of the change of funding focus under the Understanding Canada program. The ICCS has served since 1987 as the administrative and adjudicative agent for DFAIT's Canadian Studies programming, which has included a number of programs, both for individuals and for institutions. It is important to note that these programs are for non-Canadian applicants only and are not available to Canadians. This applies to the Understanding Canada programming and to the following. I won't read through these, except you might want to know the reference to FEPs and FRPs, because a number of speakers this morning commented that they had benefited under these two programs. All right. Now, there were also under this program availabilities to institutions, and they included these. And you can see the first one having to do with conferences would have been very important. The ICCS role in all this has been to ensure the eligibility, first, and the academic quality, second, of applications to these programs, and to carry out their financial administration. Therefore, as you can imagine, the ICCS has been a major player on the international scene. This brief information about the ICCS, the DFAIT, the ACS, the CSN, and Understanding Canada program, which is regular vocabulary for people who do Canadian studies, whether nationally or internationally, but might not be as familiar to those who are here for the education program, serves as background and context for the further information to which I will now turn in considering the contributions and accomplishments of international scholars of Canadian literature under the Understanding Canada program. Methodologically, I will proceed in two ways. First, by presenting data from the various programs administered by the ICCS on behalf of DFAIT since 2008. So for the period of 4 years. Secondly, by considering 4 case study examples of international Canadian studies research contributions to Canadian literary studies, again, since 2008. The case studies include the first 2 volumes of the Polish Association for Canadian Studies journal, Trans-Canadiana. Secondly, 2 recent collections of essays edited by international Canadian Studies literary scholars, both in 2012. Thirdly, a very recent 2013, that's 2 there, so fourthly, I guess, a recent 2013 publication issuing from the ICCS's last conference in May 2012. So, let's look at some data on research grant results administered by the ICCS during the 4-year period of the Understanding Canada program. Now, I will slide through these slides quite quickly. I'm going to put up one here, which gives a lot of detailed information, but I won't pause on that because I'm a little more interested in kind of a conclusion on the year by year. But so you can see there that in 2008-2009, first year under the program, there were 259 awards handed out under different categories. But what I want to flag is that conclusion in that, and so I went through all the awards, and then anything that had even a vaguely literary kind of reference to it, I counted it as literature. Okay, so in English and in French. And the conclusion is that 15% of those awards could be counted as being to the area of literary studies. So, the next year, in 2009-2010, there were 253 awards handed out, and again, to have sort of study synthesize those, of that 253, there was about 10%. In the year 2010-2011, there were 256 awards, and out of this, there was about 12% had kind of literary content. And finally, in the last year of the program, 2011-2012, there were 229 awards, and again, out of that, there was about 12% that had a kind of literary focus. Well, I think one could reasonably observe that these figures are not terribly favorable as far as production in the field of Canadian literary studies is concerned. Over the 4-year period, of all the awards handed out, the average was about 12.25%. Yet, moving on, work was accomplished. And in particular, work was accomplished under one of the 5 themes, and that was the theme of diversity. Okay, so you can see here that managing diversity continued to offer the most productive venue for literary studies under the Understanding Canada Award. So not only was work produced, but I hope, as illustrated by the 4 case studies that I'll turn to now, quality work was produced, though not necessarily through the ICCS DFAE Understanding Canada program. Some scholars, as the examples will show, proceeded without ICCS or DFAE funding. Let me begin, however, with an example of work that was produced from one of ICCS's member associations, the Polish Association for Canadian Studies, and in particular its first 2 issues, issue 1 and 2, in 2008 and 2009. Now, I mentioned earlier that the amount of Canadian studies research activity and expertise in countries around the world can be a humbling realization for Canadians, and Poland, I think, is a case in point. The extent of research and activity work on Canada by Polish scholars is, I think, very impressive. The publication of the Polish Journal of Canadian Studies is just one branch of that activity, and it is funded by the funding that association got annually from ICCS DFAE under their programming. Published in 2008, so at the very outset of this 4-year period, the Understanding Canada program, Trans-Canadiana 1 coincided with the 10th anniversary of the Polish Association for Canadian Studies. So it took 10 years for it to get its own journal up and running. Not a small accomplishment for an association in a country where resources are not that plentiful. And it also coincided with the first year of Understanding Canada. So in that regard, the journal's first issue does reflect the earlier pre-Understanding Canada years, which, as the volume's introductory essay on the history of Canadian studies in Poland makes clear, Canadian literature remained the dominant discipline. This is certainly borne out by the number of Canadian and Quebecois authors and critics whose name appear in the table of contents, and you can see them there. The list is even longer yet a year later in Trans-Canada 2, where essays on transculturalism and on work by authors such as Quebec's Sergio Capis or Pat Lucas and Anne Hébert, and English Canadians Joy Kagawa, Emery MacDonald, and Yan Martel confirm contributors' knowledge of Canada's multifaceted literature and its place in the study of that country. Well, fast forward to the end of the 4-year Understanding Canada period, 2012, and to the publication of 2 separate volumes by international Canadianists, each offering considerable CanLit or CanLit content. In re-exploring Canadian space, redécouvrir l'espace canadien, Dutch co-editors Jeanette Dentunder and Bettina Van Hoven are a reflection of the slow, or maybe not so slow, shift in the focus that literary scholars brought because of the pressures, I think, brought to bear by the 5 themes of Understanding Canada. Because they propose that rather than substitute traditional research themes like arts, literature, linguistics, history, sociology, and geography, that the changed focus of Understanding Canada could, and I quote, add a new dimension to the study of Canada. So they're trying to get around the constraints, and they do a good job of it because it's, as a result, their collection encompasses writings by those studying the arts and literature, as well as writings by social scientists, and it includes both English and French-speaking scholars. The richness that can be found in this multitude of perspectives and approaches to exploring Canadian space, they assert, is characteristic of the way in which Canadian studies is practiced nowadays. It is therefore appropriate, they go on to say, to celebrate 20 years of Canadian studies in the Netherlands. And note again that this is a production at a landmark. It's 20 years in the Netherlands, it was 10 years in Poland. The point to make here is that literary studies do continue to feature in work published with the support from DFID and its Understanding Canada program, but it's done in an interestingly kind of creative way. Alongside such essays as The Netherlands and Canada in Afghanistan, or A Forest for the Future, Making Peace in the Great Bear Rainforest. So those are 2 sample titles, very much non-literary. They have literary studies, such as, and I'll give a few examples, The Troubled Spaces of Lynn Cody's Cape Breton, Lire d'or, les œuvres littéraires dans l'espace canadien public, or Ghost Towns in the Making, Hugh Hood's The Basement Side and Duncan Campbell Scott's In the Village of Legion, or Le discours identitaire des Acadiens du Sud-Ouest de la Nouvelle-Écosse, or a final example, L'espace politique chez Leonard Cohen et Hélène Dorion. This is, I think, a fairly solid component of Canadian literary criticism. Well, the second case study from 2012, I think it's up there, right, is Ava Doria Botel's edited collection Unruly Penelope Symbols, Narratives of English Canada. And it points to what may be a future path for international Canadianists seeking to share their interest and expertise in Canadian literature, namely the publication with Canadian presses, in this case, Verduyn University Press, of research resulting from funding outside of DFID and the ICCS. Darius Botel is a Spanish scholar, one of a very active group of Spanish specialists of Canadian literature, including 2 participants in the workshop here, whom we heard this morning, Ana Maria Florial and Belen, who have made Canadian literature and literary criticism the heart of their academic careers. While some Spanish scholars have benefited from DFID and funded ICCS programs like the faculty enrichment or faculty research programs, the FEPs or the FRPs, the collection Unruly Penelope Symbols, Narratives of English Canada, is the result of work funded by, first, the Spanish Ministry of Education, as was signaled this morning, but with support from the press, from Wilfrid Laurier at Canadian Press, through the Canada Book Fund, and through one of the contributors to the volume, Dr. Samara Camrelli, who's with us here, through her institute, her then Trans-Canada Institute at University of Guelph. This volume offers 8 essays on Canadian literature by a mix of Canadian and international scholars, 3 of whom again with us this afternoon. So Professor Cancellation has an essay in there, as does Professor Spread and also Martin Lucas from Spain. The volume is insightful, or is noteworthy, I should say, for its insightful essays on the evolving character of Canadian literature and Canadian literary criticism. As a final example on the contribution to Canadian literary studies by international colleagues, I would like to comment briefly on the most recent publication proceeding from ICCS's own activities, namely its biennial conference. Every 2 years they held a conference, a collection, Cultural Challenges of Migration in Canada, les défis culturels de la migration au Canada. Its 460-page volume is co-edited by Klaus-Dieter Oertler, former president of the ICCS, and prior to that, former president of the Association for Canadian Studies in German-speaking countries, and that is its title, together with Patrick Henberg, who is a Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa. Given the termination of the Understanding Canada program in May 2012, which meant the end of funding for International Canadian Studies, this may not only be the most recent, but also the final volume produced through the ICCS's biennial conferences. There is no reference to the ICCS conference with which the volume originated, a conference that was planned in keeping with the priority areas of Understanding Canada, and that took place in the immediate aftermath of the cancellation of the program, announced on May 1st, 2012, to the disbelief and distress of many of the conference participants. At that conference, it was a buzz with people saying, what happened? It was hard for conference presenters to proceed with the research, given most people were talking about now what. Over half the essays in the collection appear in the 3rd section, which is labeled Literature and Language, Littérature et Langage. The first 2 sections, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. The first 2 sections, the first one is Social Science, Sciences Sociales, and the second one is called, the second section is Meta-History or Meta-Histoire. Each offer only 6 essays for a combined total of 12, with the balance of the book, so 14 essays, on Canadian and Quebec literatures, in English, French, and even one in Spanish. Once again, literary studies emerged to the forefront in an examination of the contemporary social experience of migration. In the wake of the cancellation of the Understanding Canada program, many prominent individuals and organizations expressed public dismay and concern about the loss of the program. Letters and columns in Canada's national newspaper, Globe and Mail, articles in national and international Canadian Studies Association newsletters, emails and fax communications from Canadian Studies Associations and centers around the world to Prime Minister Harper's office and the Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird, as well as to provincial premiers who were not party to the decision-making process that led to the termination of the program, all questioned the elimination of the program with a record of return not only in terms of knowledge, but also of finance. Its budget of approximately $5 million has been documented as earning revenues 3 times expenditures. So where was the great cost saving? And many people have stood those figures up against the amount of money the Harper government put into celebrating the war of 1812. Today, none of the protests has undone the government's decision to discontinue Understanding Canada. And I think it's not going to happen until something else changes at the Ottawa. Meanwhile, in the realm of Canadian literary studies, the work of understanding this country, I believe, has continued in the area of literature and literary studies abroad. And I hope that the data and the case studies that I present only too briefly here this afternoon have shown that.